All right. Hi, I am Stephanie, and I am the introducer for the group. Our debate is on the topic of a functional assessment, or a functional analysis versus a functional behavior assessment. Susan will be debater number one for the support of a functional behavior assessment, and then Dan is going to be debater number two for the support of a functional analysis, and then Curtis will be presenting our conclusion. So the field of behavior functional assessment has evolved over many years. It all started with Skinner's early writings. It can take many different forms, such as analog assessments, naturalistic assessments, and then interviews. Rep and Horner stated in their research in 1999 that the functional analysis constitutes the most powerful tool for identifying the purpose of problem behavior. And the reason that a functional analysis is so powerful is because the sources of variance are controlled experimentally, which allows strong statements about which factors evoke and maintain the problem behavior. The functional analysis shares a characteristic with general applied behavior analysis in that it seeks to change behavior, but then it also has a distinguishing characteristic in that it seeks to explain the function of the presenting problem in terms of present and past environments, and then it attempts to change that environment so that appropriate behavior produces the same function but more effectively. In a typical functional analysis, the situation is similar in nature, meaning it represents a replication or a simulation of the natural environment. This simulation makes it possible to determine clearly whether problem behavior is a function of generic classes of controlling variables, such as positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. And the simulation is also similar enough to the natural environment so that identifying these generic classes of controlling variables leads to the development of interventions that are effective also in the natural environment. Functional analysis demonstrates that while behaviors might be similar and also while the conditions might be similar, a careful analysis can produce different hypotheses and very different interventions. Over the last 5 years, there have been many studies using functional assessment procedures to change problem behavior. Functional analysis is also very similar to experimentation. The critical feature in both experimentation and functional analysis is that the person doing the experiment is manipulating each factor that is thought to contribute to the occurrence of the problem behavior. One question that many professionals have raised in the past is how one would know in advance which variables are worth manipulating when carrying out a functional analysis. The answer to this is from the interviews. The information that is gathered from the original interview is usually the initial basis for developing hypotheses about the purpose of problem behavior. The interview will tell researchers what appears to be an important factor in the occurrence of the problem behavior. For example, if a student engages in biting after a demand is placed, it tells the researchers that that student is probably trying to escape tasks. The interview, as well as all methods of functional analysis, focuses on 3 topics: a description of the problem behavior, the triggers for that problem behavior, and the reaction that the problem behavior evokes from others. This has been called an ABC approach, which means antecedent behavior consequence. And then the other side of our debate is a functional behavior assessment, or an FBA, which was mandated for the Individuals with Disability Act of 1997. An FBA is required for all students with problem behavior that may be in jeopardy of moving to a more restrictive environment if that problem behavior interferes with their ability to learn or their peers' ability to learn, or the problem behavior is a manifestation of their disability. The IEP team is required to conduct an FBA and implement a behavior intervention plan to reduce this problem behavior. The steps of conducting a thorough functional behavior assessment consist of operationally defining the target behavior, indirect assessments, direct assessments, constructing a hypothesis of the behavior's function, and finally developing a function-based intervention. FBA data may be collected using direct or indirect methods. The direct method, also known as the descriptive method, consists of observing the target behavior in the natural setting, and it also includes scatter plot assessment and ABC data collection. The goal of the direct observation is to gather information about which environmental variables predict and maintain the target behaviors. And then there is the indirect method, or an informant method, which involves gathering information from the person with the behavior of concern, and also gathering information from those that are in direct contact with that individual. This method can include interviews, rating scales, checklists, and questionnaires. There are a large number of published indirect assessment tools available, including the functional assessment interview, and then there are also a number of rating scales and checklists, including the functional assessment screening tool, the motivation assessment scale, the questions about behavioral function, and many others. So as you can see, there are many similarities and differences among an FA and an FBA. Both a functional analysis and a functional behavior assessment have a number of advantages and disadvantages that will be shared, and Susan is going to start out by sharing the support of a functional behavior assessment.
Okay. As Stephanie said, I'm going to talk about the functional behavior assessment and some of the positive aspects of that and why that might be considered over a functional analysis. One of the things that needs to be considered is the time commitment that each one requires. Traditional functional analyses typically can be very time-consuming. A 2003 review by Hanley, Iwata, and McCord found that the majority of FA studies included 2 or more test conditions with 3 or more observations for each condition, and each session lasting 10 to 15 minutes. Additional time may also be needed for preparation prior to administering the analysis, and this type of time commitment may not be feasible in an applied setting. On the other hand, much less time may be required to conduct a functional behavior assessment. In their functional assessment handbook, O'Neill and colleagues suggested that data should be collected via direct observation only until a clear pattern has emerged. They recommend a minimum of 15 to 20 occurrences of the problem behavior and a minimum of 2 to 5 days. The actual length of time required then for any given target behavior is going to depend on the frequency of that behavior. And for frequently occurring behaviors, the time requirement could be relatively short. Indirect assessment, surveys, and interviews are even more time commitment friendly in that they can be done as time allows and when people are able to do it. Another consideration is the training requirements. Ideally, the implementer for a functional analysis is going to have training, experience, and extensive knowledge in conducting a functional analysis. If this is not possible, those conducting the procedure should be supervised by someone who is experienced, and they should receive training prior to the implementation and then also guidance throughout the process. Again, from a trained expert. During an assessment, on the other hand, according to a 2008 study by Katsianis and colleagues, special education teachers and paraprofessionals are commonly the staff that collect data, the ABC data. In fact, O'Neill et al. In their handbook, again, recommend that the observer be someone who is familiar with the person with the problem behavior, not an outside observer. They also state that 45 minutes of training to become familiar with the data collection system is generally adequate for those collecting that data. They also may require some additional ongoing support for troubleshooting as necessary. In order to remain compliant with the BACB professional and ethical compliance codes, behavior analysts involved with staff implementation of either analysis or assessment procedures should be cautious. Code 5.03 indicates that tasks should be delegated to others only if they are capable of performing the tasks competently and safely. For this reason, it's important to ensure that proper training and oversight is provided for either method. Another consideration is the location where the assessment or analysis might take place. Functional analyses are traditionally conducted in a contrived setting away from the client's typical day-to-day routine. And for this reason, there is concern that variables, especially antecedent variables, that are related to the natural setting may not be detected in this contrived setting. According to Compliance Code 4.07, which states that possible barriers to implementation should be identified, when conducting a functional analysis, it would be important for the behavior analyst to explain to the caregivers and other staff that this is a possible barrier to accurate results. On the other hand, ABC data collection as part of the functional behavior assessment is conducted in the natural environment, and it evaluates both antecedent and consequence variables that occur naturally within the environment. We also want to consider risks or how restrictive a procedure might be, and there have been a number of risks identified with the use of functional analysis. First, because behaviors contact high levels of reinforcement during analysis sessions, there is the possibility of temporarily strengthening the behavior of concern. Also, performing a functional analysis procedure creates a latency to the initiation of treatment, and during this time, the behavior of concern is allowed to continue. This may expose the client or those working with the client to a harmful situation. Finally, during a functional analysis, target behaviors are deliberately triggered, which may not be ethical for certain behaviors. These three risks are of special concern when the target behavior could be a danger to the client or others, and it is directly related to the core ethical principle of do no harm. In addition to describing the limitations of performing an analysis in a contrived setting, the behavior analyst should also thoroughly describe the risks involved. And besides these risks, there is also an added concern of it being a restrictive procedure because of the disruption it causes to the client's routine when he or she needs to be removed from the typical activities or schedule in order to implement an experimental analysis. Conducting a functional behavior assessment, on the other hand, creates no such disruption for the client. And because it's simply an observation, there are no risks of deliberately triggering a problem behavior. Problem behaviors occur only as they would have naturally. This is in direct line with the Compliance Code 4.09, which is concerned with least restrictive procedures. Finally, we want to look at how reliable the method is. As stated in Compliance Code 2.01, clients have a right to effective treatment, and although FDA procedures cannot establish a confirmed relationship between environmental variables and the target behavior, it has been shown that combining direct observation with indirect assessments can result in a hypothesis that is useful for creating effective behavior change programs. I'm going to share two studies that have shown this. Gale et al. In 2011 used observation and interviews to hypothesize a function that was then confirmed through an experimental analysis. They then created a treatment program which was effective at increasing positive behaviors related to meal times in 2 of 3 of their participants. They reported that while the interview did not provide detailed information, it did provide information about time periods that were not able to be observed. And then the observation was able to provide the detail that was missing from the interview. So they concluded that both the interview and the observation were necessary to the assessment procedure, and again, they were able to implement an effective behavior change program based on their results. One other example is Arndorfer et al. In 1994. They used interviews, observation, and the motivation assessment scale to identify controlling variables for a number of problem behaviors. The hypotheses they generated from these assessments were then confirmed by experimental analysis, and they also were able to put in an effective behavior change program based on these results. And they were able to do this for 2 of them. A couple of other ways of increasing the reliability of a functional behavior assessment is to utilize a variety of respondents for the indirect assessments. So to ask, to interview different people, and also to have a number of people fill out the surveys or questionnaires. And then also to use multiple data collectors for the ABC data collection. And in this way, to gain more information that may make the assessment supporting the use of functional behavior assessments.
Okay. So I'm Dan, and I'll be looking at some of the proposed weaknesses of functional analysis, how the available literature addresses those weaknesses, and how those adaptations can really negate some of the limitations and essentially turn those into strengths of the functional analysis method. So the first thing I wanted to discuss was the issue concerning time commitment. Initially described by Iwata in 1994, functional analysis consisted of 4 conditions, those being attention, tangible, escape, and control conditions. All can just extrapolate that across multiple sessions or even days, you're looking at a major time commitment and something that's not easily accomplished in an applied setting. The literature does describe conducting brief functional analyses and for doing so. In 1999, Wallace and Iwata reduced the length of sessions from the original 15 minutes to 10 and 5 minutes respectively. They found that this reduced session length provided results basically indistinguishable from the longer 15-minute sessions in regards to the identification of function. The second method for reducing the overall assessment length is described by Kang and Iwata in 1999, and what they did was test only the most likely conditions. So the information they gained through interviews were the conditions that they ran, whether that was the attention condition or escape. They only conducted one along with a control, reducing that overall length pretty significantly. In 1991, Northup et al. Also limited the assessment to 90 minutes in total length, and each of these examples found results comparable to their lengthier assessment counterparts, again in regards to determining the function of that behavior. This understanding ties directly to Ethical Code 1.01 and a reliance on scientific knowledge. So when we have an understanding that brief functional analyses can be conducted with validity compared to lengthier functional analysis, this really renders that concern of time commitment moot, and we can be assured that we are recommending the most appropriate practice or methods. Another point I'd like to discuss was this concern of training requirements. As Susan noted, functional analyses require the knowledge of a professional with extensive training in ABA. Often though, this person is simply not available to the clients who need their services. In this case, functional analyses may be abandoned, and there is some literature that supports the training of staff to conduct functional analyses in these scenarios. Through a training consisting of instruction, modeling, and feedback, both Horner in 2012 and Iwata in 2013 found that staff with limited or even no clinical experience with functional analysis were able to successfully and accurately conduct functional analyses. So again, this relates to our ethical code, specifically 5.04 and the design of effective training. Using procedures described within the studies noted previously, we can be assured that we are in compliance with this code of providing those effective trainings. One thing to note about training individuals to use such procedures is another part of our compliance code, 5.01, and the supervisor's competence. So before we begin any trainings or suggest any methods, we have to be assured that the individual providing the training is qualified to train others and has an extensive knowledge of that functional assessment methodology. Location has also been cited as a limitation of functional analyses. Functional analyses conducted in quiet settings away from the natural environment do not do the best job of accurately reflecting the conditions that naturally occur and that those behaviors naturally occur under. On the other hand, in vivo assessments do. An in vivo assessment is basically a functional analysis and all those relevant conditions conducted in the natural setting. So this can be a home setting, a supported work environment, or a classroom. But regardless, an in vivo assessment allows that extraneous noise or those extraneous variables of the natural environment to be taken into account when determining function. So this helps us be in compliance with Code 4.06 and describing the conditions necessary for program success. So with an in vivo analysis, we can do this in more detail and with more accuracy. Also implied within a functional analysis is the reinforcement of problem behaviors. So we expose the behavior to certain reinforcing contingencies to determine under which conditions they most likely occur. So at least we do this for a short time. This is, as Susan has mentioned, this has led to the concern that functional analysis procedures strengthen the problem behavior. And although reinforcement is necessary to determine that function, this can be a deciding factor on whether or not the procedure is recommended and or used. So to address this concern, the Connors et al. In 2000 used a discriminative stimulus. In their example and in their study, they used a colored room, but I imagine the SD can be changed. But the important thing is that they used this stimulus to control the behavior of concern. So since the behavior is only reinforced in the presence of that SD, the behavior strength was severely reduced, while still allowing for the identification of that maintaining variable. And although the inclusion of an SD reduces the strengthening of a behavior, it's important to note Compliance Code 2.05 in this regard, and that we are informing the client of the possibilities and also allowing them to exert their rights to deny treatment or to understand how treatment is going to look. Finally, I just wanted to talk quickly about what is possibly the biggest strength of a functional analysis, which is its reliability. So functional analyses provide a definitive functional relation where a functional behavior assessment simply describes those conditions surrounding behavior. This understanding of function in turn leads to a greater treatment efficacy, which has been shown in a host of studies. I'll only cite a rather prominent one, Carr and Durand in 1985, and their description of functional communication training. And they used a functional analysis to determine the function of problem behaviors in individuals. And in identifying that function, they were able to create a communicative replacement response for the individual to use in lieu of the problem behavior. And what they found was this severe problem behavior, the rate of the problem behavior. So tying in this function to treatments has a positive effect on consumer outcomes. Again, this relates directly to our ethical code, specifically 2.10 and treatment efficacy. So when we understand function, specifically the function of behaviors, we can be assured that we're prescribing treatments that are not only function-based, but have empirical support for their effectiveness. So I'll turn it over to Curtis to summarize and present our conclusions. Thanks.
Okay, I'll first start off by summarizing the functional behavior assessment. It first starts off with the time commitment. For FBA, you're required to collect indirect assessments as well as direct assessments. This can include 15 to 20 occurrences of the problem behavior and can take 2 to 5 days, as where a traditional functional analysis is 4 test conditions with 3 to 4 sessions lasting 10 to 15 minutes. We feel that the best use would be a brief functional analysis procedure where you test the most likely conditions and run 5 to 10 minute sessions for a total of approximately 90 minutes. As far as training, as mentioned earlier, special educators and paraprofessionals are most often the staff completing the functional behavior assessment. Their training includes approximately 45 minutes, and they should be accompanied by a behavior analyst to help troubleshoot any issues. This is advantageous because the observers are familiar with the client. However, adaptation that will allow for functional analysis to be equally as effective would be training the implementers to effectively implement the procedures. That's been displayed in the literature. Location has been an advantage of the functional behavior assessment in that it occurs in the natural environment. However, in vivo analysis, using the functional analysis procedures mentioned, provide for the analysis in the natural environment and limits the disruptions mentioned as one of the restrictions. And it also enables you to test a cause and effect relationship, as where the functional behavior assessment only allows you to form a hypothesis. There are certain circumstances that we feel where an FBA would be advantageous, and those would include behaviors such as aggression or self-interest behavior, where only using maybe brief observation, basically ensuring that no harm is done to the client. By using a functional analysis, you're providing the most efficacious treatment and relying on scientific knowledge. So in conclusion, we feel that functional analysis with certain adaptations is the better option.